يا أرحم آمين يا الله. آمين يا الله.
All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Yesterday we talked about a number of different tafsir, and we pretty much focused on the relationship between the names that were mentioned here. So we said the first opinion basically regarded that there is no particular classification that we can see within these names, as much as just recognizing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala given hidayah or given il-ihsan or given or each was min al-salihin, etc., or each was preferred over the other people. And certainly we talked about al-Biqa'i, and that he had a different opinion and considered that there was actually a classification, or at least there was a reason for this combination. Number one is the relationship with Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after a long period of not having any children and being barren, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as a result of his contribution, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given him that gift of Ishaq and his grandson Yaqub. Okay, so Ishaq would be his son, and certainly another question was asked, well, why was Ismail delayed till the end? So some scholars considered that he was delayed till the end because he was included with this group, that although he was asked, that is Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, was asked to leave his son Ismail far away, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still had still had compensated him for leaving and basically doing as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ordered him to do, which is abandon his son in the land of Becca. So we talked about about these stories before, but here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكُلًّا فَضَّلْنَا عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ, despite the fact that he was ordered to leave Prophet Ismail alayhi salam, but he compensated him for this contribution, which is leaving his son all the way in the land of Becca, but still Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had compensated him by making him himself a new nation, or a nation that would continue and carry on the legacy of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, all the way in a deserted area in the land of Becca. And of course, we would continue. This group was basically classified as the group that was given power, that was given political leadership, etc. So whether we're speaking about Dawood, Sulaiman, Ayub, Yusuf, Musa, and Harun, each was actually considered a political leader, and that's a form of authority. ومن آبائهم وذريتهم وإخوانهم وجد بينهم وبينهم إلى صراط مستقيم. And this definitely would include that even if the names are not listed on here, whether it's from their fathers, the meaning the fathers of these names that were mentioned, or whether it's the offsprings from the names that were mentioned, or even their brethrens, that they were actually chosen, anointed. And then from that, we basically related this page with Surah Fatir, or at least in a certain portion in Surah Fatir. أورثنا الكتاب الذين اصطفينا من عبادنا, and we talked about فمنهم ظالم لنفسه ومنهم مقتصد, and we related that part of that surah with this part that we're actually working on. ذلك هدى الله يهدي به من يشاء من عباده. That's in order to bring about the main theme, that's the guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would guide whom he wills from his servants. In other words, the ones that would carry the legacy, the ones that would live the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the ones that would embrace The guidance are basically the ones that would get the compensation, and the ones that would carry the legacy, and the ones that would get the victory. أولئك ولو أشركوا لحبط عنهم ما كانوا يعملون. If they had associated partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then all that they had contributed would basically fall in corruption and would not make it to success. أولئك الذين آتيناهم الكتاب والحكم والنبوة. Those are the ones. Who are those? So is أولئك referring to the prophets that were mentioned, or is أولئك basically referring to all those that would be guided, and basically all those that would embrace al-kitab, 2, the legislature, and 3, the wahi that was sent on to the prophets. And therefore, if anybody were to deny, would not want to carry that legacy, then at the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will replace it, but with people that would be believers. I think here's a really important point here. When it says, لَيْسُوا وَكَّلْنَا بِهَا قَوْمًا لَيْسُوا بِهَا بِكَافِرِينَ, we had given it as a legacy to carry, as a responsibility, as a word, as a principle to embrace, and basically put it into practice. When you look at لَيْسُوا بِهَا بِكَافِرِينَ, but that's already, that's by default. Why would it confirm again, لَيْسُوا بِهَا بِكَافِرِينَ? Well, that's an affirmation. And in the Quran, affirmations are frequent in the Quran. Why? It's in order to emphasize a certain meaning. It's in order to certainly shed that light and make it clear that it is not enough to basically just carry out a legacy, but you have to believe in it yourself. You have to believe in it yourself. You have to spread that legacy by putting it into practice. When you talk about قَوْمًا لَيْسُوا بِهَا بِكَافِرِينَ, you're talking about not only faith in mind, but also faith in heart that appears on behavior. Okay. أولئك الذين هدى الله فبهداه مقتده. Now that's where we basically left off right here. Those are the ones. So is أولئك referring to this أولئك, for referring to ذلك? I want you to look at the word ذلك, أولئك, and أولئك, and right here تلك. Now, what are those? I want you to look at these. We've got تلك, okay, and we have ذلك, we have أولئك, we've got another أولئك. Those are actually demonstrative pronouns. But when you say ذلك, أولئك, it's basically letting you know you're connecting ideas together, that they're not separated from one another. It's basically a complete idea. It's a complete concept. It's a complete paradigm that you basically understand, and you recognize that just as everything that you would see in this world is related to one another, the sun, even though up in the skies, would basically have some things that are related with what grows on earth. Same thing, you're talking about the water up in the sky. It basically is related to what grows on earth. It basically gives the nutrients. It basically gives the hydration. It gives a number of different things to make life possible. And here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that just as the paradigm in creation was created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, well, the dynamic is also part of the system. The dynamic and how things basically run, from the way that we would see the idea, the practice, the implementation, the implication, all of that cannot be separated from the system that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created. In other words, we look at the system that was created, and therefore we could see the implication of that system and how we relate to it. And that's the same thing where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that ulaika, dhalika, that all of those pieces of information, that they are related to one another and that you cannot separate them from the other facts that were mentioned, but they're actually one whole. So when it says, and it gives us that demonstrative pronoun, it's in order to let us know that that is how, this is how things are functioning. This is why, this is the reason, number one. Two, this is how things function. Number three, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hikmah and wisdom works in mysterious ways that you may not understand and think of it as just happening just because. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that no, whether we're speaking about نرفع درجات من نشاء, whether we're speaking about power, whether we're speaking about probably offspring or what happens in the future, what happened in the past, and what is related to all of these things don't just happen on their own, but they happen with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wisdom basically running through it. This is important, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wisdom basically running through all of this. And this is important to keep in mind. If you say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wisdom running through all of this, that's when you relate to the final one, فَبِهُدَاهُ مُقْتَدِهِ. Then all you need to do is take their legacy, take their guidance as the path that you would walk through, as the path that you would demonstrate in practice in your life, because that's the way to basically get to the highest levels of one, hidayah, two, al-ihsan, and you'll be amongst the salihin, and certainly you would be amongst those that were chosen, and certainly that would put you on the path of as-sirat al-mustaqim. And certainly if you were not to take those steps, then you're going to be facing another trajectory. That is your all that you had contributed would basically just fall out and break into pieces, and then you would not actually find it. Now, here's the other thing. I want you to compare this portion of that surah right here, just to remember 147, with how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us of الذين كفروا. Remember how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us about الذين كفروا, how they considered, let's see, which portion of that, which portion was it? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us of الذين كفروا and all of that they had contributed, it basically all that they had built, whether it was talking about the big fortresses that they were building, or whether it was talking about all those different investments that they were putting in, all of that, basically قد خسر الذين كذبوا بلقاء الله. Now, this is important to basically see and connect with that ayah. Let's see, where was it? It was basically telling us how, here we go, connecting it with this one. Okay, here it is. This one, this portion of it. فقد كذبوا بالحق لما جاءهم فسوف يأتيهم أنباء ما كانوا به يستهزئون ألم يروا كم أهلكنا من قبلهم من قرن مكناهم في الأرض. That's what I want you to see right there, because in the beginning of the surah, it was telling us to see a pattern. Those that basically had the power, when you look at مكناهم في الأرض, they had the power. They had the political power, perhaps military, perhaps even science. We would usually think, because certainly when we talk about Darwin's theory portrays that man in the beginning was a very primitive man. They would call them Stone Age and basically portray them like they are nothing but savage creatures and all of that. But when we look at the different things that they were capable of doing out of nothing, basically just simple tools. We may think of them as just simple tools, but if it wasn't for this simple tool, we would not have actually learned how to develop them into more sophisticated tools. So our intelligence today is not necessarily making us more intelligent or smarter than how our ancestors were. In fact, if you were to look at what they had built, you were to say that they were intelligent creatures. They were basically building and capable of living in the wilderness with very simple tools, but they were basically capable of one, bring in security, bring in wealth, health, etc. And certainly their lifespan was way better than our lifespan. So when you look at مكناهم في الأرض, you're talking about a different kind of tamkeen and not just security, but you're talking about power. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the beginning of the surah, you could see right there that it was in ayah 6, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us that these people were given power, they were given tamkeen, they were given the ability to control, they were given the ability to build modernity, a certain level of modernity. Of course, ما لم نمكن لكم. In fact, that modernity that they were living in was actually more advanced. I want you to look at this one. When it says ما لم نمكن لكم, that it was actually more advanced than what we have. Yes, even of what we have today. You look at buildings and monuments that they had built, they are definitely still standing today, even after thousands and thousands of years. But today, although it may seem more sophisticated, but we could say that it's not as sturdy and certainly not as strong and certainly will not last as long either. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that their tamkeen was farther than just mental, it was also physical. It was also giving them the capacity to do what, whether this was referring the ayat were directed at the people of Quraysh or whether it was directed at us, at the end of the day is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that despite all the advancement and all the privilege and all the power that they had managed to maintain for many years, but still Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not leave their tamkeen. And in fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically أهلكناهم بذنوبهم. I want you to look at this one because this is a key word right here. It says أهلكناهم بذنوبهم. And they were destructed as a result of the sin that they had committed. Now compare that. So they were destructed as a result of the sin. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala أنشأنا من بعدهم قرنا آخرين. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created a new nation, new nations or new generations after them that they are different than them. Now, were they better? What happened? Was the beginning of that nation better? But then eventually they went off the track. All of those situations that happened. We know with Bani Israel. In the beginning, Bani Israel, Yaqub and his children were doing way better than the later Bani Israel down the road. And for example, even today's Bani Israel, they were doing much better. Even though you could say that perhaps the Bani Israel today, they might have probably had tamkeen Does Israel have tamkeen? Oh, yes, it certainly does. It has tamkeen by having at least Israel controlling America, controlling all that money that basically comes from the Americans themselves, goes to Israel. All the power. Israel hit Iran. And then, even though Trump was saying, no, we're not going to hit it, but then who was making the order? Who was making the decision whether America was going to get involved or not? It was Israel. Was saying, oh, you don't make the decision whether you're going to get involved or not. Who was it? It was basically Bani Israel. It was Netanyahu who said, I'm going to be making the decision whether Iran gets hit or not, and I'm going to make the decision for you, America, whether you get involved or not. You don't make the decisions for me. I make the decisions for you. So long for those that actually think that they were the ones that voted for Trump. Now you had actually voted for, or you probably didn't even vote for. Yeah, but the truth of the matter, your president is actually Netanyahu without you realizing. Yes, Netanyahu without you realizing. All right, so getting back to the subject, فَأَهْلَكْنَاهُمْ بِذُنُوبِهِمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destructed them with their own sins or due to the sins that they had committed. And شَأْنَا مِنْ بَعْدِهِمْ قَرْنًا آخَرِينَ. Let's go just 10 pages away from this one, which is still within the same surah, and that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala نَرْفَعُ دَرَجَاتٍ مَنْ نَشَاءُ. It's coming with the same idea. The other one was telling us أَهْلَكْنَاهُمْ بِذُنُوبِهِمْ. They were destructed as a result of the sins that they had committed. But in this ayah, نَرْفَعُ دَرَجَاتٍ مَنْ نَشَاءُ. You contribute for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will elevate you. How? In what ways? And is it giving you intelligence? Is it giving you power? Is it giving you maybe the legacy to be carried after even your death? All of that works in mysterious ways that you may and may not even realize in how it will come about. And that's what we get out of the word أولئك and ذلك, all of that. That's to tell us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not let any small amount of contribution go as suda, go in the air and not recognized. But as a matter of fact, every single contribution, every single good deed will actually find a way that it will come back to benefit you. You share a meal, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will let that be as this power that will come back to you. You give a smile, you I don't know, you massage your mother-in-law's feet or whatever it is. This will actually come back to you. It will be something that will give you, inshallah, and by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it will come back to you, and it will be the contribution that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will recognize, and you will be compensated for whatever contribution you put in. Therefore, قُلْ لَا أَسْأَلُكُمْ عَلَيْهِ أَجْرًا. Say, I will not ask you for any compensation. Why? Because I'm getting it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm getting it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I don't need your payment. I don't need your reward. And this is extremely important. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that there are some that when they give, they basically would give with al-man wal-adha. What is al-man wal-adha? Al-man wal-adha is basically to give in one, they're expecting a payback. So they would continuously remind the person, remember what I did this for you. Remember when I did that for you. That's al-man, it's bragging. Al-adha is, well, since you didn't pay me back, now I'm going to basically carve out all the contribution that I had put in, and since you refused to pay me back, I'll carve it out of you. That's al-adha. Whether carving it out by harming that person, or whether carving it out by giving themselves the justification to take their amount that they had contributed in them by simply saying, no, I have to take this out. I was the one that made you who you are. I gave you the papers. I gave you the money. I was working and we contributed. Therefore, I own you. That's al-adha. That's al-adha. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us and teaches us how to contribute. And the most important contribution is the contribution of basically da'wah, delivering the message as the prophets had done. That's the most important contribution. In huwa illa dhikr al-alamin. Now here's one thing. Certainly, this is a reminder, but I thought it would be a good idea to go to Tafseer al-Qurtubi, and we're going to look into a couple things here. Number one, I'm going to make this one a little bit bigger for you to all see it. Okay. وَهَبْنَا لَهُ إِسْحَاقَ وَيَعْقُوبَ كُلًّا هَدَيْنَا وَنُوحًا هَدَيْنَا. And al-Qurtubi uses this system, and he said, there are three different matters to discuss in regards to this ayah. Okay, which ayah are we talking about? Well, we're talking about, let's see, which one, which ayah? Which ayah was it? No, wait a minute. 68. Okay, where was it? Here we go. This one. Okay, and basically this portion of it. Okay, وَوَهَبْنَا لَهُ إِسْحَاقَ وَيَعْقُوبَ. This portion of it. Okay, what does al-Qurtubi say in that regards? Number one, he said, well, وَهَبْنَا لَهُ إِسْحَاقَ وَيَعْقُوبَ. That's basically to say that was a result or as a compensation for what he had basically committed, بَذْلِ النَّفْسِ فِيهِ. The word that he uses is بَذْلِ النَّفْس. What does بَذْلِ النَّفْس actually mean? بَذْلِ النَّفْس means to put in النفس is different than النفس. النفس means breath. النفس means life. What is the difference? When you say بذل النفس, in other words, he contributed everything in his life to just do it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The money that he got was basically in order to, one, yes, part of it is for him to be stronger for dhikrillah. And the other part is he's got the money, he'll basically use it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whether it's for donation or whether it's for making room for da'wah or whatever it is. Everything was basically part of badl nafs. Every effort, every energy, every power that he had, he basically invested it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's basically badl nafs. And he said, and all of that was jaza'an lahu ala ihtijaji fi ddin. It was to basically reward him for investing in order to do the da'wah and basically bring about all that argument to defend the deen. وَكُلًّا هَدَيْنَا. When you look at the word كُلًّا هَدَيْنَا, where's كُلًّا right there? The word كُلًّا actually means in each and every single one of them was actually considered in a place of hidayah. We're talking about Ishaq, we're talking about Ya'qub. Okay, so in other words, at the end, each and every single one was actually carrying the same legacy. وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِهِ. Now, when you look at وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِهِ, hold on, let's actually go out a little bit and see it. Maybe on this page, it would be easier for you to see it since, here we're going to be covering on this page right there. Okay, let's just see on this portion of it. Oh, Ustaz Umayya, you want to say something there? Go ahead.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I get the answer of the one I asked you about وَهَبْنَا لَهُ إِسْحَاقَ وَيَعْقُوب. How يعني it's not because Allah gave him Ishaq after the second marriage, but because of his defending the deen. I catch it. right?
Say it again. Say it
وهبنا
again.
when you said yesterday أتته الدنيا راغمة. Why
Right.
أتته الدنيا راغمة? Because he defend the deen, so Allah gift him Ishaq wa Yaqub. It's not related to, as I understood it before, but, that how it comes to dunya raghima ta'tihi, and he get married the second wants to have babies. But this is here I catch the meaning. Is it right? ووهبنا له, why Allah gift him this? Because he defend the deen. يعني he like pay him.
Well, yes, but that doesn't mean that Ismail alayhi salam was also not a hiba. Okay, but this one right here is emphasizing. That doesn't mean that Ismail was not a hiba.
No, it's hiba because he obeyed the order of Allah that to slaughter him. The same.
Well, yes, but he obeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He obeyed. Okay, so are you saying that Ishaq is later?
No. I said Allah gift Ibrahim alayhi salam إسحاق ويعقوب because he defend the deen, الاحتجاج في الدين.
Right,
وبذل
right.
same thing we can say that Ismail alayhi salam is hiba min Allah, it's a gift from Allah because he accept uh, order of Allah when his wife Sarah alayhi salam asked him to leave Palestine and go toward Mecca.
So, okay, let me explain one thing.
Uh-huh.
The Jewish scriptures, they would say that that Hajar and Ismail alayhi salam, that Sarah was jealous of Ismail and Hajar, and then she had asked that he would basically desert them in that land. But that would basically mean that Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam is in that situation committing a sin. Yes, so you succumb to a woman's jealousy and you basically decided to desert them in some faraway place. But to the Muslim scriptures, that wasn't the case. It wasn't as a result of jealousy. It was as a result and as an obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for a reason, for a hikmah and a wisdom to come, why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted him to be in that specific land. So according to the Jewish scripture, that no, Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was just wanting Sarah to feel comfortable again, and he basically just decided, you know what, I'll just let them dehydrate in this faraway area just to bring comfort to Sarah. Okay, but that's, by the way, even if you were to go back to Genesis in the Old Testament, it's quite interesting that even in Genesis, maybe I can actually go back to it right there. Okay, and let's see, I'm going to go back to it so you can see it yourself. Okay,
can we take him as a dalil? Old Testament.
Take what they had said as a dalil?
Yeah. يعني نستشهد بهم.
And as an evidence that
yeah.
Okay, so here's the thing. The only times that we can take it as a dalil, as an evidence that can support an argument, is if we have evidence on our own that basically would affirm that this evidence, or at least this piece of information, was actually accurate. Okay, now if you were to go back to Genesis, for example, you would see that it was actually saying that the reason why, or one thing that will happen to Ishmael, according to basically Ismail, according to Genesis, was that God was going to make him a great nation. So he was basically to take him to Becca, and that God will make him a great nation. And then basically the Kedars, which are his sons, were basically going to be the ones to carry on a certain legacy. And then in Deuteronomy, it would basically tell you that that there was going to be the Kedar nation, that they were going to be singing in the mountains a new song of God, a new song of basically a new song of prayer, etc., and all of that. It's a whole thing. But in Islam, that no, yes, she was jealous, but the reason why he takes Prophet Ismail alayhi salam to the land of Becca or Mecca was not as a punishment for them, or as let's call it a mental or at least a support for Sarah to make her feel better. No, it was in obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
It's guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Exactly. It was guidance. It was basically just like with dhalika and ulaika, it was basically to work out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's commandment to basically do something in mysterious ways to carry on the legacy in a different spot for many years to come in how things will unfold. Okay. Now, it's important to mention that, of course, for Bani Israel, they basically considered that that Ishaq was the legitimate son, and considered that Ismail was the illegitimate son, or at least he was the son of a concubine, and therefore was not necessarily an honorable son. Okay, why did they want to do that? Because they were actually coming from the offspring of Ishaq and Yaqub alayhi salam. So they wanted to say that they are superior, and versus Ismail alayhi salam that they are inferior, and that they were deserted, inferior, and therefore, of course, consider themselves, even today, for example, what you see in Gaza, they will consider that that continues the story of the fight of the superior against the inferior, and that all of those are the go'im, or considered basically the subhuman creatures that are supposed to be working in their service. So everybody that is not of Bani Israel, to them is supposed to be working in their service, and basically giving them the dunya and the privilege that they deserve. So to them, killing all the people in Gaza, or killing all the people even probably in the whole Muslim world, it doesn't matter, because anyways, they're just goyim, they're subhuman creatures anyways, that they don't even deserve to live, and that they're supposed to be in their service because they are superior. Okay, just keep that one in mind. Of course, you could say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us right there that the whole issue is not necessarily of what race you come from, but is actually what you contribute for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Are you part of a salihin? Are you part of al-muhsinin? Are you part of those that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had elevated? In other words, to be really superior is not an issue of race, but is an issue of what you had contributed. And that's why he said, نَرْفَعُ دَرَجَاتٍ مَنْ نَشَاءُ. Okay? And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us, even the one that was considered as basically abandoned or left in this faraway place, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala فَضَّلْنَا عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ had considered kullan. When you look at the word kullan, that means Ismail, that means Ilyasa, that means Yunus, that means Lut. Each and every single one of these, although abandoned, although left deserted in certain ways, but the Lord Almighty had actually preferred them and basically put them at a higher position than all of those alameen. Is that the alameen to mean their alam? Or is this talking about all nations, including the nations that we are living in today. Okay, that's what, of course, continuing with Tafseer al-Qurtubi, that's what he's going to explain. So when he said, وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِهِ دَاوُدَ وَسُلَيْمَانَ وَأَيُّوبَ وَيُوسُفَ وَمُوسَى وَهَارُونَ. Is this talking about ذُرِّيَّتِهِ, the pronoun ha right there? Maybe I should erase all of the scribbling, right? Let's say, is the pronoun ha right here when you're looking at ذُرِّيَّتِهِ? Now, in general, in Lugha Arabiya, whenever you have a pronoun, the pronoun is going to refer to the nearest mentioned noun. The nearest mentioned noun was actually Nuh. Okay, now, but the sentence is basically saying وَنُوحًا هَدَيْنَا مِن قَبْلِ. That would actually mean this is talking about min qablihi, meaning before him. So I would basically have what would be considered as a hidden pronoun. In Lugha Arabiya, there is a hidden pronoun, and there is a connected pronoun, and there's a disconnected pronoun. Okay, Lugha Arabiya is just a very, very vast and very intricate. Okay, so when you look at this one, well, if you're talking about the nearest hidden pronoun, this would be Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, because it was talking about Prophet Ibrahim, and that Nuh alayhi salam was previously, or previous to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, was actually guided. So that's why scholars actually had differences of opinions on when it said وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِهِ. They said, well, this is referring to, that is the pronoun, referring to Ibrahim, and others said it was referring to Nuh alayhi salam. And he'll tell you that, the scholars like al-Tabari, al-Qushayri, Ibn Atiyah, that they had basically chosen Nuh alayhi salam, and that's referring to Nuh alayhi salam. But here's one thing. Some scholars actually had objected to this. Well, why even object? I mean, why even care about what's that pronoun referring to and who's it referring to? Why can't we just get the whole theme of all of this, and rather than go into these little intricate details? Well, that's part of it, tadabbur. It's part of it, tadabbur, because we recognize that each and every single letter, each and every single haraka, each and every single word matters, and why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used this word or use this pronoun. So as a Muslim, this isn't details that, oh, come on, let's get to the theme and stop going over each and every single one. No, this is part of al-ibadah. This is part of al-ibadah, to see the ayat, to read the ayat, to read those pronouns, and to see the scholars and what they had said, all of that. It's part of it, tadabbur. It's because I care about each and every single word and every single letter, and that's why we're commenting about it. So some scholars said, well, when you look at dhurriyatihi, what does the word dhurriya actually mean? Dhurriya means offspring. Dhurriya is supposed to be, if it's an offspring, it's supposed to trace back to the beginning. In other words, if we're talking about dhurriyat X or Y, that means it traces back all the way to me. Okay, or all the way to X or Y. Okay, now when you look at the objection, they said, well, dhurriyat Yunus and Lut were not tracing back to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. Why was Yunus and Lut even? So they basically questioned that here, وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِهِ, is this referring as well, not only Dawood, Sulaiman, Ayub, etc., but this is referring to these ones as well. So there's no question that Zechariah is part of the offspring of Prophet Ibrahim. There's no question about Yahya that he was. Ilyas, we don't know much about whether he was part of Prophet Ibrahim's offspring, but Isa alayhi salam is another objection, because his mother was part of Bani Israel. There's no question about that. But is the woman's children considered part of your offspring, of a man's offspring, or not? Why? Because the woman's body acts as a place of fertilization, as a place where whatever is put inside, that's basically like the land that basically is fertilizing that egg and so forth. Okay, but when you look at, for example, you look at the plantation. So you see the man planting the seed, the sperm that is, and that sperm basically grows in the woman's womb, etc. Then is that considered what is an offspring of that man? And therefore, we would not consider the daughter and her children as offspring going back to that man. So that's another thing that al-Qurtubi basically wanted to discuss. We'll discuss it in just a bit. How do we understand the word offspring? Does it have to be related to the man's side and tracing back all the way that way? Or can it be something even expanded even further to include the girls as well? Okay, but here's a question. Well, Lut alayhi salam, here some scholars said that he was his nephew, and therefore Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam would be his uncle. Others actually said he was his sister's son. Now, was he his sister's son? Was he? There's really no evidence on that. It was more of Israeliyat that had mentioned that. But sometimes, going back to the question that you had asked, are we going to use the Bani Israel's resources as considerable resources? We talked about that before. We cannot use it as considerable resources unless we basically would have an affirmation from our resources, from the Muslim resources, or at least authentic resources, not just mentioned in Muslim literature, but something that is basically mentioned as tracing back to the Prophet ﷺ to make sure that we have our information basically accurate and valid information, and we don't just adopt or plagiarize any piece of information here and there. So Ibn Abbas had basically said, well, all of those prophets that were mentioned, should we count them together? We said there were 8, but let's count them right there. Okay, so here we go. Okay, Ibrahim. Okay, well, Ibrahim, of course, that was the main one. Got 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So got 18. Which prophets are actually left out of all of these? Okay, so we got 18 prophets that were mentioned just in this segment. Okay, and certainly you got 18 prophets mentioned just in this one. How many total prophets were mentioned in the Quran? 25. 25 prophets mentioned, and just in this portion, 18 prophets. Okay, let's see. Ibn Abbas said all of those prophets are basically included and mentioned as part of the Riyat Ibrahim. He said even though some of them may not have been perhaps included from this from the father's side or even the mother's side, because even Prophet Lut alayhi salam was considered his nephew, but the uncle in the Quran basically was considered as part of the person's ancestry. So your uncle, paternal uncle, we're speaking about. What's the evidence? They said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us a story when كنتم شهداء إذ حضر يعقوب الموت. And what happened? قال ما تعبدون من بعدي. What do you worship after me? They said نعبد إلهك وإله آبائك إبراهيم وإسماعيل وإسحاق. Wait a minute. So they said, we worship your Lord and the Lord of your fathers, Ibrahim, Ismail, and Ishaq. Who was saying that again? That was Prophet Yaqub's children. So who's Prophet Yaqub anyways? Remember, he had a second name, Israel. Okay? The other name was Israel. Okay? So Bani Israel, the children of Israel, are the children of Yaqub. Okay? And here they said, we worship your Lord and the Lord of your fathers. Fathers, Ibrahim, Ismail, and Ishaq. They included Ismail even though he's not actually their father. He's actually their uncle. Right? Remember, Yaqub is the son of Prophet Ishaq. So therefore, Ismail would be their uncle, or at least Yaqub's uncle. Okay? So in other words, they considered that their dad's uncle, that is Bani Israel, considered their dad's uncle as part of their fathers. And this is important to keep in mind. Okay, let's see. But here's one thing. Isa alayhi salam is not part of Ibrahim, at least from that, but he was actually a daughter's, or at least Maryam's son. And they said in Fatima, radiallahu anha, the Prophet ﷺ, Al-Hasan wal-Hussein, were actually considered as the grandchildren of the Prophet ﷺ, even though they were actually the grandchildren of, well, they would trace back to Ali ibn Abi Talib. Ali ibn Abi Talib is the Prophet ﷺ's cousin. Okay? But still, Ali ibn Abi Talib married to Fatima. The Prophet ﷺ still considered her sons as basically sons to himself. Okay? And that's why some scholars, they basically said the girls' children, they're also considered as your walad, as your own offspring. Now, here's one thing. When you look at this debate, is a girl's son or daughter, are they considered an offspring of the actual male relative? Okay. Now, why is that even a big deal? Why is that even an issue? Okay. The implication of it is quite interesting. Okay. If, let's say, someone made a will, and in that will, they basically said, this will, I want it distributed, or they basically made a waqf, not a will, but al-waqf is similar to the will, but the difference between al-waqf and the will is that al-waqf would be basically the service. They would use this service and everyone would make use of it and they could not sell it. The will, it becomes their property. We talked about will in details, but anyhow, if this person made a will and said, this would be for my children, are those children going to include my offspring? Or is that will / waqf going to include the daughter's children as well? Or is this going to be solely for the male offspring? That's that debate. That's that debate. So let's say if we were talking about the differences of opinions, okay, Abu Hanifa considered that if we're speaking about the relatives. If it's a daughter or if it's a son, then that situation, they're going to be considered as part of the offspring. But considered that the cousins are not part of the offspring. Okay. And same thing, they said the maternal cousins, Ibn al-Khala. So what are we talking about? Ibn al-Khala. So my aunts, okay, my maternal aunt's children, that they're not cousins. Oh, sorry, not delete. They're not actually part of the offspring. Okay, that's for al-Hanafi. For the Shafi'i, they considered that every single relationship that is part of al-Rahm al-Mahram. What is al-Rahm al-Mahram? Al-Rahm al-Mahram is basically relating to a relative that if I were to assume one is male and the other one's female, that would be a mahram for this man and this woman. Okay. And they considered that if this offspring is coming from a person that is a mahram to me, then that's going to be considered as part of my offspring. So they considered that cousins, male cousins, or all the different generations of male cousins or female cousins, that they're actually part of the offspring. So my third and fourth generation cousins, they're related to me. They're part of our offspring. Okay, let's say al-Maliki, they considered that no, girls are not included. Why not? They said, well, because when you look at the ayyusikum Allah fi awladikum, said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yusikum, that he basically is giving you a will on your awlad. And he said, well, il-walad, what is il-walad? Il-walad actually means to bear. Okay, so according to the Malikis, they said walad, it also has another meaning, which means a male offspring. So they said this is a male offspring because when it said yusikumullahu fi awladikum, since the other meaning for walada is not only to bear, but also means male offspring, then this should be exclusive to male offsprings, and girl offsprings are not included. Okay. And that was Ibn al-Qassar, who was, one thing about Ibn al-Qassar, he was one of the most important Maliki scholars that wrote the reason for differences of opinions, specifically between the Maliki scholars. He was from Baghdad in Iraq, but he was Maliki. I wonder what happened. To be honest, I wonder what happened to the Malikis of Iraq. If somebody's from Iraq, please tell me, do you still have Malikis in Iraq? I know that there are Malikis in Bahrain, but what happened to the great scholars of the Maliki madhab, like Ibn Khuwaizimandad and here Ibn al-Qassar, and you had a great number of different Maliki scholars that lived in Baghdad. Wonder what happened to them, and I wonder if there are still Malikis in Iraq. But anyhow, so Ibn al-Qassar, who kind of like Ibn Rushd was also Maliki, and in his book Bidayat al-Mujtahid, Ibn Rushd, like Ibn al-Qassar, they considered to understand fiqh, you need to first go back to the reason why these scholars had differences of opinions in order to remove al-ishkal, in order to remove the ambiguity. And in order to remove the confusion and to understand the controversy, you first have to lay your finger on the dispute and why there is a dispute in the beginning. So Ibn al-Qassar had basically said, well, the ones that had considered that the girls are part of the relatives and her children are basically part of the offspring, they said, well, the Prophet ﷺ had said about al-Hasan ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib, even though he's the son of Ali ibn Abi Talib, but also the son of Fatima, that he said, Inna bini hada sayyid. The word ibni actually means my son. So now, therefore, we would say that the Prophet ﷺ had said, Inna bini, this is my son, and therefore the Prophet ﷺ considered that the daughter's children are part of your offspring, and therefore include them in the family. The other evidence, they said, well, il-walad is conjugated from the word at-tawallud, which actually means from bearing and from bearing children. And they said, well, definitely, whether the child was born as basically born from the mother's side, or whether it was a plantation basically in the mother's womb, meaning where you understand what I'm talking about, they considered that all of that is basically considered, this is min at-tawallud, meaning the offspring. So the offspring is not necessarily of plantation, but is also of a tawallud, of delivery, of labor. So therefore, consider the walad min at-tawallud, walad, just as in this right here, awladikum, they said, well, al-walad actually means to bear, to go through labor, and not necessarily the other name of meaning male. Okay, and that's why he said, they basically said, well, Al-Quran said, وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِهِ دَاوُدَ وَسُلَيْمَانَ, until basically included even Isa alayhi salam, even though he was the son of Maryam alayhi salam, but he considered that he was part of his offspring. Okay, so therefore, when you look at all of that, this is basically letting us know and giving us an indication that all the 18 names mentioned here, they're basically belonging to the offspring of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, even Ilyasa and even Ilyas, that they're actually part of the offspring. And for Yunus alayhi salam and Lut, that they're actually part of the offspring right there, at least from one of the sides. And Isa alayhi salam, that he's basically part of the offspring from the mother's side. Okay, so, and of course, when we're speaking about the name Ilyas alayhi salam, was he necessarily part of the offspring from Ismail alayhi salam? We don't really know much about him. Some actually said he was part of the tribes of Yosha ibn Nun, and others debated and all of that, but we don't really have any evidence on that. We just know that most of these names are considered Alam Ajami. They're not Arab. None of those names are Arab. How do we know that this name is not a Arabi name? Because the Arabi name would go back to a root in Lugha Arabiya, just like Salih. Saluha, Muhammad, Hamada. But all these names are not Arabic names. All the 18 names are not Arabic names, whether they are Hebrew or perhaps Aramaic or perhaps a Semitic language. Who knows what Semitic language that goes back to? At the end, we just know that those are not Arabic names. But it doesn't matter whether it's Arabic or not Arabic. It's all about the legacy. There are some qira'at, though, that basically read the name Ilyasa as illa yasa. Illa yasa. It's quite interesting. Or Ilyasa. Al-yasa, al-yasa, or Ilyasa, wal-yasa. Okay. Okay. Walla yasa, yasa. You know, at the end, you can see different qira'at in the name, and certainly it's still going to be a alam ajami. So at the end, of course, we're not going to be getting to the origin of the name. So not much that we could do about understanding the name and what it actually, oh dear, let's actually reload. The page basically just closed out on us. We're going to get there, right? Now, you know, here we go. I know it was somewhere around here. I'm going to find it, inshallah. Is this it? No, going farther. Sorry, but the page all of a sudden just closed out on me. Okay. I think that am I in the right place? But why can't I just see? This is 93. We're going back. Because we're supposed to be on 86. Okay, here we go. This is the place. Okay. Now let's continue. Oh dear. Okay, now let's continue right there. Scholars also debated whether Ilyasa is actually Prophet Ilyas's friend or not. Like that, and some scholars actually said he was before Prophet Zakaria, before Prophet Yahya and Isa, and some actually said Ilyasa is Ilyas himself. And al-Qurtubi objected and he said that's not actually true, because Idris is basically the ancestor or the grandfather of Prophet Nuh alayhi salam. Regardless, okay, at the end, they're all ism ajami, they're all non-Arabic names. Okay, وَمِنْ آبَائِهِمْ وَذُرِّيَّاتِهِمْ وَإِخْوَانِهِمْ وَجَتَبَيْنَاهُ. Okay, when you look at the min in Arabic can have multiple meanings. Part of those meanings is لِلتَّبْعِيض, to mean a portion of something in, of course, in the context of having a bigger portion of something. So, in other words, when it says وَمِنْ آبَائِهِمْ وَذُرِّيَّاتِهِمْ, this is talking about and from their fathers. Not all the fathers made it to faith. Not all their dhurriya, all their offspring made it to faith, and not all their brethrens made it to faith. Just keep that one in mind. Yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did compensate Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, and sometimes that compensation you could be making, for example, dua for the guidance of your children, but you never know. Maybe one will be guided and perhaps all his children are misguided, but down the road, generations to come, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give guidance to one of those from the offspring as a result of what you had contributed. He may not recognize it. You know, it was quite interesting. Part of my grandma's ancestry is actually related to they're basically Torres in Spain. And part of the Torres in Spain were actually the people, they were considered the Moors, the Muslims that were forced to embrace Catholicism in Spain. So you start wondering, like, okay, and she's, you know, my grandmother is also part Guarani, which is basically the indigenous tribe in Paraguay. But you look right there, how is it that our ancestry, now all of my grandmother's family and even my grandmother died as Catholic. My grandmother herself was actually a Catholic nun for 17 years, and she had to leave the convent because she had manic depression, or today is classified as bipolar. Okay. But subhanAllah, I mean, all her family is Catholic. All right. And then subhanAllah, my mother makes it to Islam and basically passes it on to that offspring. Is it possible that maybe part of my ancestry was maybe part of the Moors, the Muslims in Spain that were forced into Christianity, so therefore I'm part Andalusi, perhaps? Be interesting to actually make a DNA test, right? Discover that I'm part Andalusi. Yeah, maybe that's why I like al-Qurtubi. I feel some connection. Sorry, man. It's kind of all right. وَمِنْ آبَائِهِمْ وَذُرِّيَّاتِهِمْ. So here, min is part, so not all of the ancestry or their fathers or their offspring was necessarily on the right path. So بَعْضَ آبَائِهِمْ, part of their fathers and part of their offspring, part of their children, were basically finding guidance, وَاجْتَبَيْنَاهُمْ, and they were chosen. Wait a minute, so why were some chosen and others were not? Why were some chosen? And why not each and every single one of those, آبائهم and ذرياتهم, هديناهم إلى صراط مستقيم وذلك هدى الله يهدي به من يشاء من عباده. Is it people that will, or is it Allah that wills? Well, you put in the will, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will your guidance, but you have to make that will to seek الهداية. What's the evidence? وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. You put in the investment of hidayah. Like what? Like give up on haram. And then you'll see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will basically give you more and more keys and open up and demolish more and more obstacles to your hidayah. And it becomes easier for you to find it. But at the end, if the person did not put the inner will to find hidayah, then they're not going to be part of those that are ijtabaynahum. So what is it ijtaba anyways? Why not say istafayna? Why ijtabayna? The word ijtaba basically means the root is jaba, okay? And jaba actually means to get water from like a pool of water. Okay, but al-ijtiba, it doesn't mean a pool of water. It just means there's a whole pool of water and you are just taking a portion of it. You're just taking a portion of it. So in other words, this ijtiba, it basically means that you were, when you take that water, what do? You basically scoop that water and you take that water for you. You basically kind of like you fetch it, you scoop it, it becomes part of you. That's an ijtiba. Why did you not scoop the whole thing? Well, you didn't scoop the whole thing, but you just took a scoop. You considered that that's all I need. That's all I need. And you just took a scoop. It's quite interesting because when you look at the word ijtabaynahum, out of all those people out there was only a selected number of people. They were the ones that were scooped out. They were the ones that were selected. All the rest, they were disregarded. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from those that are mujtabeen, those that are chosen, those that are selected, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would see their sara'ir, would see their intentions, would see their commitment, their determination, their purity, their inner purity, and then they would be the ones to be selected out. It's quite interesting when you look at certain genetics as well. You could see there are certain genetics that would be passed on, and subhanAllah, you would say religiosity as well. Certain families are religious, it becomes like by nature, by their genetics. You will see certain families, they're all doctors. Certain families, they're all business people. Certain families, they're all ulama, they're all huffaz. Certain families, they're all engineers, whatever, So is religion also the same way? Is it also passed on? Well, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell us to invest in our religiosity and in our children's religiosity, those that come from a family of ulama or from a family of salihin would actually make better salihin than the ones that had to struggle out of a dahan. What is it, dahan? Dahan, let me write that word down. Dahan, okay, how am I going to write this? Okay, here it is. Here we go. I'm going to write that word down. Dahan. What is it, dahan? Dahan means smoke. Dukhan or dahan means smoke. But this isn't talking about smoke. This is talking about some murkiness that might actually have its in let's say implication or remains in the person's heart. And we could see that many times. People that probably had a history of going into prison, they're more likely to go back and enter it again. People that had a history of crime within their family, they're more likely to have children that will commit crime. The children, they basically get accustomed, they basically get introduced to that lifestyle, and it becomes easier for them to trespass. Well, it's not just a crime, but that's the same thing when we're speaking about salah. They get introduced to going to the masjid, they get introduced to dhikr, they get introduced to memorizing Quran, they get introduced to ilm, they get introduced to the areas of salah, and it becomes something that is basically fertilized in their hearts. It becomes something that grows in their hearts. It becomes who they are. So when we look at ijtabaynahum and we look at a dakhan, it's definitely harder for someone that had a history of, let's say, deviance to then set a step and set the determination and a foot on the path of the religion. But wait a minute, that contradicts something that the Prophet ﷺ had said in the hadith, that خياركم في الجاهلية خياركم في الإسلام. The best of you during Jahiliyyah are the ones that are best during or after Islam. Number one, this hadith is actually not authentic. Number two, even if we are to assume that it is authentic, this isn't necessarily saying that having a bad history, or let's say a history of deviation, would be a better way to enhance a way to becoming a good Muslim down the road. And here's that manipulation that happened to a certain Sufi sect. A certain Sufi sect, ironically, just like today we have feminist Muslim, feminist da'iyas and all of that, we also had throughout history something really similar to that, whether it's al-Hashashin or whether it's Ikhwan Safa, and whether it's, some Sufi sects. They also would teach their murideen, their students, to engage in sin, and they would say, and basically they're manipulated. That's absolutely against the religion, but they were so deviant that they actually thought that to become a better Muslim, you have to first have a bad history. And after having a bad history, that is only when you would find guidance, and that you would embrace it wholeheartedly because you had felt the darkness and felt the pain of sin. That's deviation. That's deviation. You don't engage in sin in order to get motivated to practicing guidance. Guidance leads to guidance. Misguidance leads to guidance. And when the person that was in misguidance, when they had found guidance, they didn't find it through misguidance. They actually found guidance, and that got them out of the misguidance. Certainly, you can have misguidance at one point. It becomes like an epiphany, and you recognize, with this epiphany, that, wait a minute, the trajectory of this is disastrous. But does everybody actually get to that conclusion before it's too late? Chances are the people that had lived in crimes, the chances are that's the lifestyle that they will continue to live, and fewer people basically make it out of it. So when you look at ijtabaynahum, it's basically what we invest in pure hearts, in good investment, in good behavior, in good akhlaq, in good in good investment to find guidance. That's what will get you into finding haqq and finding guidance. ذَلِكَ هُدَى اللَّهِ يَهْدِي بِهِ مَن يَشَاءُ. That's the guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would guide whom He wills from His servants. And that's the evidence when we were saying, well, how would they be selected? Well, ذَلِكَ هُدَى اللَّهِ يَهْدِي بِهِ مَن يَشَاءُ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ. What does that mean? That's the guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would guide whom He wills from His servants. In other words, if a person were to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's what will lead you to guidance. وَالَّذِينَ اهْتَدَوْا زَادَهُمْ هُدًى. Those that would find guidance, زَادَهُمْ هُدًى. They'll be increased in huda, in guidance. But there's no way, if you don't find guidance, that you will be increased in guidance. You have to first find guidance, and then that's what's going to lead to finding further and going stronger and higher with your guidance. Okay? And certainly, if they were to worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَلَوْ أَشْرَكُوا لَحَبِطَتْ أَعْمَالُهُم. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for those people that had served and submitted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had asimahum. Wait a minute, al-isma, does that mean to be infallible? wait a minute. So if you were to say infallible, we're not infallible as Muslims, right? No, we're not infallible as Muslims. Well, what does infallible actually mean? Well, infallible actually means you are so guided that you become immune to committing sin. Well, there's such an immunity. Some people actually become infallible. Well, prophets and messengers are infallible, but you and I are not infallible. Why not? Because there are three different types of nafs. Nafs al-ammara bis-su is part of it. The nafs that basically orders you to commit sin. You've got a qareen that's also telling you to do what is wrong. So you are not infallible. You have your own nafs al-ammara bis-su is right there. But al-isma is for the prophets and messengers. Why are they infallible? Because they would be the role models and they were disciplined directly by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're disciplined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes. وَاصْطَنَعْتُكَ لِنَفْسِي. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells Prophet Musa alayhi salam, made you, developed you, disciplined you for me. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells Prophet Musa alayhi salam. اصْطَنَعْتُكَ لِنَفْسِي. You were all of those different things that you went through. It was basically developed in you for a reason, for this legacy for you to carry, O Musa. Same thing with Prophet Ibrahim, same thing with Prophet Nuh, Muhammad sallallahu etc. All of that. Okay. Now, أولئك الذين آتيناهم الكتاب والحكم والنبوة فيكفر بها هؤلاء فقد وكلنا بها قوما ليسوا بها بكافرين. And we said أولئك would mean what? أولئك would mean those. Demonstrative pronoun. Okay. Okay. الذين آتيناهم الكتاب. Okay. So what is أولئك? ابتداء وخبر. What is that supposed to mean? So that's basically the clause that it's giving you, an informative clause, and then it would also give you, so there was a prelude and there was a conclusion. There was a prelude, there was the beginning statement, and there was also the concluding statement within it. Okay, what does that mean? أولئك الذين آتيناهم الكتاب والحكم والنبوة. الحكم, those are the ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given al-kitab, the book, revelation. Al-hukum can mean legislation and can mean power, authority, and the nubuwwah. Okay, al-hukum. Al-hukum, he basically said al-ilm wal-fiqh, knowledge and understanding. Why did you say fiqh, understanding, and not legislation? Because al-ilm, when you say al-ilm wal-fiqh, when you use the word that would actually mean knowledge and understanding, and not exclusive to Islamic jurisprudence. Okay, فَإِن يَكْفُرْ بِهَا, if they were to deny it, it is referring to what? بِآيَاتِنَا. If they were to deny it, let's see, where's that ayah? فَإِن يَكْفُرْ بِهَا, the word biha actually means it. It's a pronoun. If they were to deny it, or if, let's do it this way, actually, so you can see it. Okay, let's do it this way. Okay, if they were to deny it, who's they referring to? Meaning the people during your time, O Muhammad. So who is this directed at? This was directed at the people of Quraysh, or was this directed at the people of Medina, or was this directed at the Arabian Peninsula, or was this directed at who? So the first opinion is that no, this was directed at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, basically the people there that were that these ayat were revealed to basically the context of their time. Okay, and then فَقَدْ وَكَّلْنَا, where's the remember when we said there's the prelude and then there's the conclusion right there? So this is the prelude. Okay, the prelude, أولئك الذين آتيناهم الكتاب والحكم والنبوة. So this is the prelude. Okay, prelude is right there to tell you, well, prelude, premise. Okay, this is the premise right there. Those are the ones that were given al-kitab al-hukm al-nubuwwah. Yet, now that you recognize this premise, the conclusion is, فَقَدْ وَكَّلْنَا, if they were to deny it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give this legacy to be carried by people that do not deny it. So therefore, you've got now telling you, this is the premise, now telling you, now the theme based on all the above that was mentioned here, you recognize the history and the paradigm in how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes truth prevail, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets you know that haqq will prevail and truth will be enhanced and will still make it. Will you be amongst those that would basically be chosen and selected out of all of that to carry on the legacy and be, but on a condition? In order for you to be amongst those that would carry the legacy, you have to make sure that you are part of what? You are part of ibadatullah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're part of those that would worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because there's no way that you can carry on the legacy unless you are part of those that submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and unless you are part of those that would be on al-hidayah and on the right path, and unless you basically do that in commitment and would be consistent in this submission, and therefore recognizing that if you were to, and if that person were to not be committed, not be determined, and not be on the Sirat al-Mustaqim, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will alternate these people with other peoples. Okay, now some scholars actually said قَوْمًا لَيْسُوا بِهَا بِكَافِرِينَ, that this was actually referring to just as this was referring and directed at the people of Quraysh, or the people that denied the Prophet ﷺ during his time. They said وَكَلْنَا بِهَا قَوْمًا لَيْسُوا بِهَا بِكَافِرِينَ, that it's also referring to another nation during the Prophet ﷺ's time. Which one is that? They said, well, this was talking about the immigrants in Mecca and the Muslims in Medina, al-Ansar, basically. Other scholars, they said, well, this isn't necessarily just al-ibra bi'umum al-lafzi la bi khusus al-sabab, and that this isn't necessarily relating to just the people that lived during the time of the Prophet. In other words, the context that this that this ayah was revealed in is not exclusive to that statement and that context at that time, but is actually inclusive to the generations later to come, in that it would be inclusive to include the believers, the jinn, the ins, the malaika, anybody that would later come to carry on the legacy. And they basically said, well, that's why it said أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ هَدَى اللَّهُ. So anybody that takes on and carries that legacy of guidance, then those are the people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said فَبِهُدَاهُمْ مُقْتَدِي. Then embrace their path. And you embrace their path, you're basically going to be included in all of those أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ آتَيْنَاهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحُكْمَ وَالنُّبُوَّةَ. They would carry on the same legacy. فبهداه مقتده. Okay, let's see what the word أولئك الذين هدى الله. أولئك, those are, again, the same thing. You've got a premise and you've got a conclusion right there. But then القرطبي, oh, it's 11:50 already. You know what? We'll stop right there. أولئك الذين هدى الله فبهداه مقتده, and we'll continue tomorrow. Let's see the issues that we'll be covering tomorrow. There is something called شريعة من قبلنا. There are 11 different, well, there are 4 resources that we would use for legislation in fiqh. And there are other resources, well, the 4 resources scholars agreed on, which is al-kitab, al-sunnah, al-ijma', and al-qiyas. But there are other 9 other resources that scholars actually had different, 11, 9, they debated about. In part of those resources, 1, al-urf, culture. 2, shari'atu man qablana, the legislation of the nations that had come in the past. Is that considered a resource? Qawl al-sahabi, the Sahaba's words, do we consider that as a resource and evidence to prove that something is part of the religion of Islam, or is that considered their opinion? And the list goes on and on, okay? But we're not going to discuss all the other resources. We're just going to discuss one piece of thing. If we know for a fact that this was a prior legislation to other Muslim nations, and that the Quran approved that this is part of that religion. Let's give an example. Prophet Musa alayhi salam. Remember when he fled that city, and then the father, well, he sees these girls trying to fetch some water, and then and then he would make the dua that he's basically seeking rizq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Was he seeking marriage? What was he really seeking? At the end is that the girls basically would come, ask him to go to their father. One of the girls, at least, goes to her father, and certainly the father then says that I'm going to basically get you married to one of my daughters, على أن تأجرني 8 حجج, on a condition that you would basically work in service for 8 years. And if you were to continue for 10, well, that's basically an extra service from you. Appreciated, of course. But in the end, is that here it is, that man, which many would think it's Shu'aib, but it's actually just a man from Madian, okay? And he basically had proposed for Prophet Musa alayhi salam to marry one of his daughters, okay? Now, is this an evidence that a man proposing for his daughter, can we consider that as evidence that it's permissible for a man to propose for his daughter? He sees a good guy and he's like, I'm asking for your hand in marriage. Well, well, not literally, okay? I'm basically, gifting my daughter to you or something like that. Is that permissible? And can we use that as evidence that, hey, Prophet Musa alayhi salam got married in that way, then therefore it should be considered as something that not at least just permissible, but at least an honorable act and therefore ethical. Can we use that as evidence? So that's what we'll be talking about, partly of what we'll be talking about tomorrow. And we'll, inshallah, discuss a number of different things as well. We're going to see a story, you could see a lot of highlights are put out there. So stay tuned for tomorrow. I'm actually excited, inshallah. We're doing well, alhamdulillah, covering al-Qurtubi. Look at us, we're actually page 452. And soon we're going to be finishing the 8th volume from Tafseer al-Qurtubi. MashaAllah, that's actually great. 8th volume. Yep, home, page over page, and yep, and continuing all of that. So inshallah, we'll see you all tomorrow. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. My friends, you can unmute yourselves if you would like. All right, I'll end the